how do we stop this from becoming the ordinary precedent in American politics? To take this back to the political context where this becomes the new means by which we adjudicate who leads our country. I'm worried about that, and I know you are too.
Very worried, very worried. There's another doctrine that comes into play here that folks might be interested in hearing about. Very difficult to prove. It hasn't played a huge role. Maybe it should play a bigger role, and that, of course, is the doctrine of selective prosecution. What's that? You're not constitutionally allowed to go after somebody. The state district attorney cannot prosecute somebody where the motivation for the prosecution is to go after them because they're a political opponent, because you don't like their political views, retaliation for their political policies, try to undermine their candidacy. If that's the motivation for the prosecution, that's just straight up unconstitutional from the get-go. Forget all this stuff we've been talking about, Sixth Amendment, interpretation, rule of lenity, unconstitutional from the get-go. And of course, many people feel that's just what Bragg was doing. Many people feel, and I'm talking about people on both the left and the right, they sense that this prosecution would have never been brought if it hadn't been Donald Trump as a defendant, and would never have been brought if Donald Trump hadn't been running for president again. And a lot of people say it's completely clear that this is a politically motivated prosecution. It should be unconstitutional from the get-go. Problem is, courts have made that claim very hard to prove. And what they sometimes require is what they call a comparator. It's like a comp in real estate value, a comparator. You got to find us a very similar case where somebody did something very much like what they charged you with, but it was somebody on the other side expressing different political views. And if you can find us that case and they didn't go after those people, then maybe you can state one of these selective prosecution claims. Otherwise, forget about it. And I'll give you an example. Here's a great example. Came out of the summer 2020, but this is a case just decided by the D.C. Circuit just last year. So some pro-life protesters had a small protest in D.C., and they chalk up the sidewalk with one of their messages, something like "Preborn Lives Matter." And they get arrested, and they get charged and convicted of defacement of public property. Can't chalk up a city sidewalk with your message. And guess what? Under the D.C. District of Columbia ordinance, defacement ordinance, they probably were guilty. But the defendant said, hey, wait a second. The folks down, this is summer 2020, down the street, there's a much bigger protest, the Black Lives Matter, and they're not just chalking up sidewalks, but chalking up the streets and buildings with their message, Black Lives Matter. And not a single one of them was prosecuted for defacement. What are you doing? And the D.C. Circuit, and this just last year, said, now that's a comparator. And if you can prove that, you have just stated a case for selective prosecution. And the amazing thing is, but of course, you're almost never going to find that. That's almost never going to happen. But there might be a comparative case like that in this Trump hush money prosecution. Do you know about this? You probably do.
Yeah, look, I think there are some other cases where you have interesting black and white instances. I'm trying to understand this doctrine of...
Wait, let me just finish that one point. Hillary Clinton was found by the Federal Election Commission in 2022. She was found that in that same election, 2016 presidential election, she spent money on the Steele dossier, the famous Steele dossier.
Oh, that's a great point. I love that.
And they booked, in their books, in the books of the Clinton campaign, they booked them as legal expenses. And the FEC actually determined 2022, those weren't legal expenses. Those were campaign expenses. And you falsely called them legal expenses. And that's a campaign finance violation. And the Clinton campaign was made to pay, thousands of dollars in fines. This is an actual determination by the FEC that seems to be a determination that they did exactly what Bragg was accusing Trump of having done. And they're located, that campaign was headquartered in New York, and there was no prosecution of them, not of Hillary or of anybody associated with the campaign, for falsifying business records to cover up a campaign finance. So that might be the comparator that could actually serve to prove a selective prosecution. In this case, I guarantee you that'll be Exhibit 1 in the Trump team's appeal